Kathy got audio?
Yes. She's able to hear.
Hey, I'm getting it through my computer now too.
Yep. And okay. So you're able to hear. So you could just drag that.
Yeah, I'm gonna turn off the phone, and we'll just do this through the computer.
Well, I think you're probably only going to be able to hear through the computer, though. So you might just need to drag that volume bar.
Okay. So I'll turn the volume off. Okay. So we'll just stick with the phone.
Probably why it separates the bandwidth anyway. So anyway, welcome. I'm Chris Craft. This conversation with Darren Kuropatwa started the other day when we were looking at the difference between knowing something and teaching something, and perhaps where the need to teach something comes in. I prodded Darren a little bit on Twitter as a result of having seen the graphic that you're seeing on. I know why there's an echo. Charles, that might have taken care of it.
Yeah, same for me. I think it might be that your computer speakers are on or something like that, Chris.
That's possible. So I'll stop the webcam because we don't need that so much. So that ought to have taken care of it. So hopefully that'll fix the echo. So I began prodding Darren a little bit as a result of seeing this. So the notion of when we know something and as we're teaching something, at one point do we need to involve kids in the opportunity to teach it as well? This model, this picture really struck me because my PhD dissertation was in medical education. It was looking into instructional design methodologies. And in medical education, there is a model that was developed in 1904 by a guy by the name of Halstead, Halstead, and he wrote a big paper called The Training of a Surgeon. And it was probably more like a book than a paper. But he wrote this book, and he said that, in essence, he said that what he wanted to do, he didn't really articulate this so well, but he said what he wanted to do is focus on the high-performing bunch of his group, of his surgical residents, and that those high-performing surgical residents would then teach some of the lower functioning, not lower functioning, but in any group there are going to be some that just get it quicker than others, some that require more help. So when I saw this watch it, teach it, do it, that rung true for the Halstedian model of which is typically called see one, do one, teach one. So I began to prod. And what we know from many years of research into instructional design is the see one, do one, teach one model is pretty bad. And the reason it's pretty bad, in medical education anyway, is because the see one, do one, teach one requires that an expert is able to articulate the reasons they do some of the things that they do. And that's a problem. Many times experts are unable to effectively articulate why they do what they do. Here's why. As we move along the continuum from novice to expert, when we're a novice, our working memory has a very high level of load in it for mundane tasks. So let's take driving, for example. I'm 34 years old. I started driving at 15. When I first got behind the wheel at 15 years old, I can recall looking at the rearview mirror and having to consider the starting of the car and the brake pedal and the gas pedal and the radio and just sort of all of this stuff to consider that now I don't think twice about. Now, because I'm older and have been driving for so long, I can do it and I can get home and have no idea what I saw or how I got there. That's the nature of what we call automaticity. Because it's a procedure, it's a skill, so two types of knowledge, right? Procedural and declarative. Because we're talking about a procedure, a skill, it now imposes very little load on my working memory because I'm what you might consider to be an expert driver based at least on experience. So in our see one, do one, teach one model, the C1 requires that the observer be able to pick up on clues that are tacit. That's a problem. Let's take a medical example. Let's take a lumbar puncture. There are certain things there are certain steps that even an expert teacher will forget to articulate when teaching someone how to do something. The reason for that is because they're automatic. In fact, when we look at the expert self-report literature, we see that when experts attempt to articulate the steps of a procedure, they leave out something like 60 to 70% of the steps. That's because those steps are automatic. Now, there are ways around that. We can put instruments in their hands, and when we put instruments in their hands, then they have a better opportunity to recall those tacit and automatic steps of the procedure and so on. But without going through detailed knowledge elicitation methods, experts are unable to self-report why they do what they do often. So the see one, do one, teach one model is reliant upon expert self-report, which is really dangerous. So what this does, the see one, do one, teach one Halstedian model does, is it propagates improper methods because it relies on expert self-report. So what happens is you end up with, instead of somebody learning the right way the first time, they learn a certain way, then they have to unlearn and relearn. Well, in medical education, of course, that means, for a lumbar puncture, that means lumbar puncture is done incorrectly and having to be redone, and patient pain and so on. One of the ways around that now in medical education is the use of simulation, plus we're doing really good knowledge elicitation to drag out of experts' heads the tacit as well as the very open and clear reasons for why they do what they do. And we're able to put that into a set of instructable steps. So that's what I did in my dissertation. We did central venous catheterization, and we used the knowledge elicitation method on experts, and we dragged those steps out of their heads, turned that into instruction, and then compared to instructional design models. So how does this translate to K through 12 education? As I started looking at this graphic, and I was looking at Darren's presentation here, I got to really be concerned that I don't want us as K-12 educators necessarily to propagate the Halstedian model unless we're aware of the fact that we often are unable to articulate certain reasons for why we do what we do. Now, Darren being a math teacher, that's a little different, because in math there is typically a clear-cut way to get from the problem being unfinished to the problem finished. So that's how all this got started, and I'd be curious to hear what you said.
Okay, so first, maybe a little bit, when I was using this particular image in my presentation, and I was making a link to medical education explicitly, you can see it in the picture. I guess the theme that I was approaching was that knowing a thing and teaching a thing is not the same thing, and that when you teach a thing, you know that thing much deeper at a much more profound level than you do as compared to when you just know how to do it yourself. And you allude to some of that in the comments that you were making, Chris. So my argument was kind of like this. In class, kids will watch how something's done, and then they'll do it themselves several times. But as in med school, they're not considered to have learned it until they've taught it. I don't consider my students as having learned something until they teach it. I know from my own experience as a teacher that I knew the content I'm responsible to teach much deeper after having had to teach it. In particular, and some of this came up in your comments, Chris, because, like you say, there's a fluidity to the way I approach it, having some experience or expertise, let's say in mathematics, in the way that I approach that content, the way I solve problems. So the students, when they were confused, I always took that as pushback. Say, okay, so I'm skipping steps. You can overdo this. You can start to explain to students too many steps so that they never do any thinking on their own, and they kind of just, here's the path you follow, and then they just, rinse, wash, repeat. That doesn't help them. But what's more important is maybe getting at the second order principles, organizing principles, how do the pieces fit together, and making that clear to students. That I don't think gives up too much of the game. That I don't think is necessarily teaching by rote. It's teaching by principle. So yeah, I am advocating here that kids should watch it, do it, and then teach it themselves, because in that third step they'll have a more deep learning experience. The stakes aren't as high in K-12 education as they are in medicine. If someone messes up solving a problem, it's not like I've messed up a gallbladder operation and there's going to be a human being who has to suffer pain from that. So, I mean, there's some interesting things in all that you said. In particular, I think this model, well, maybe, you know, you've uncovered some of the issues as they apply to medical education. I think this does work in education, and I base that opinion largely on my empirical experience and also on, you know, what I've read about how people learn. So, I mean, you know, push back against that, anybody.
Yeah, and this is not just Darren and I, so anybody's welcome to jump in. And just for the record, I don't inherently disagree at all. K-12 education does have a slightly different connotation. You know, there's no malpractice if, you know, somebody messes up a math problem like there is if somebody messes up a lumbar puncture. My only concern, I would agree that, yes, see one, do one, teach one can be applicable to K-12 education as long as we understand the issues inherent in expert self-report. And the fact that
that's really interesting, though. Like when you were describing expert self-report, because it's exactly like what you said is bang on. A lot of people do stuff they've got no idea why they do it that way. And I think what makes us better teachers is the exploration of, well, why do I do it that way, so that I can pass it on to someone else. I didn't mean to cut you short, but that piece in particular is kind of a theme that really resonated with me when you were speaking.
Yeah, you're right on track. And in fact, when you said that you teach by principle, you know, that's where we really need to hammer home with this, because someone turning around and teaching, you know, there's no real issue there, provided that they've effectively learned. And when you said that you want to teach by principle, by proxy, your students will teach by likely those same principles or very similar ones. So we need to make sure that those principles are unbelievably accurate. And if I know you as a practitioner are considering that. My fear is that if we propagate this model and we say your kids have not effectively learned until they've effectively taught, I'm fearful that will turn into someone just teaching what they've been taught without really the examination of those principles.
Well, okay. So, see, I think kids can learn. I'm still sharing my screen, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to open up another web page and show you a little screen, which you probably have seen before.
While you do that, I want to address a quick comment in the chat room, one from Charles. You are absolutely correct. And in fact, one of the instructional design models that I think is marvelous for 21st century learning is called GEL, Guided Experiential Learning. And it provides for, it is a decidedly chunked model. It's one that says we're going to identify what's learned, we're going to use a really good source of instruction, and then we are going to chunk it and ensure mastery at each one of these steps prior to moving on.
Well, and then the person could then demonstrate the ability or their skill by putting it all together, right?
That's exactly correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think the kids necessarily have to get to the point where they're teaching it in order to say that they've learned it. I think we can learn it in kind of like, so I imagine you can see the screen and you see it's a Kathy Sierra graph, ability on the vertical axis, time across the bottom, and it's about how to be an expert. Can everyone see that? Okay, so if you look kind of the dropout, I suck at this, I give up. So imagine, the first time you ride a bike, you fall down and you never get back on again. Yeah, you suck and you'll never ride a bike. But you get back on the bike and you try again and you can kind of ride. And you just kind of, okay, I can ride now. I'm not going to worry about this anymore. And you can stay at that level, which means you can ride the bike. Great. Or if we're talking about skates, you can get on skates and skate. Great. But to get experts have different perspectives. They don't think they can do it. They think they can do it better. So kids in school, it's okay if they stay at the amateur level, if the particular content they're looking at isn't something they're going to engage in the future. But if they want to become expert, then they got to look at it as like, I'm okay, but I can get better. Whereas instead of just doing it. So watch it, do it, teach it. If you can do it, which, you know what? That's where I was at. When I started teaching, I could do it. I could do the math. One of the subjects I had to teach was, I had to teach moral education as well. That's a class that's pretty unique in Quebec. So I'm teaching that to grade 7 kids. So how do you teach kids moral education without reference to a deity, and how can that be done? And I had some ideas about it, but the act of teaching it, through the struggles I saw my students having, through the mistakes, the challenges, the questions they asked, the confusion on their faces, when I thought I was speaking English and they looked at me like I was speaking Sanskrit. And I would go home and I'd say, okay, wait, let me rethink this. How can I do this better? How can I explain it to them in a way that's meaningful and resonates with them? That pushback over time had me develop a deeper understanding to the principles in the content areas that I was teaching. And I made those ideas explicit to the kids and had more success in subsequent classes largely because of that. So I think this comes back full circle to what you were saying earlier, Chris, that experts do stuff and they're not necessarily conscious of what they're doing. And this is where the act of teaching becomes a reciprocal, it's a reflexive act, because in the act of teaching, if you're doing it well, you get pushback from your students. And that forces you to get better at how you're teaching it. If all you're doing is being an expert and saying, well, look, I can do it, so you can do it too, that's not helpful to kids. That sometimes happens in math classes. You know, and sometimes math is used to abuse kids. Say, you know, if you can't do this, you're an idiot. I've shown you how to do it. And that's unfortunate. If you can't do this, then I haven't made clear to you what the principles at play are. If you take that attitude as a teacher, your students are more likely to have success, which is the point. Sometimes people get put in a position where they have to teach a course that they've never taught before. So they're like, you know, and I've been in that situation. You're like one page ahead of the kids just the night before. You're learning what you need in order to get through the following day's classes. And if you can do the problem, then, you know, that's good enough for you at that point, because it's kind of crisis management. That's not the ideal. And that's not the place that you want to stay. The real challenge in education is dealing with those situations, kind of like the rookie doctors that you were talking about earlier, Chris. When if they mess up the procedure, that's a problem. That's significant pain. If you have a teacher that messes up the teaching and the kid never comes back or is turned off of the subject, or they never have an opportunity to relearn that content, that can do damage too. That's harmful to kids. So in ongoing teacher professional development and maybe in pre-service teacher training, it's these second-order principles of the disciplines that we teach that need to be made explicit to teachers. And more importantly, how do they then uncover those principles in the work their students do? So I don't know if I'm just blathering there, but...
No, in fact, I wholeheartedly agree. I think we as educators need to be significantly more cognizant of reflexive practice and examining. We do so much talking about how we're going to teach, and I'm afraid that we don't do enough talking about what we're going to teach and the real in-depth conversations about, you know, our preconceived notions about even something as simple as math. I don't mean it like that, but something as simple as a mathematical concept. You know, why do we think that certain things hold true, and you know what underlying assumptions are there, and what principles are there, and so on. I want to address what Mike Walker said about outliers. Malcolm Gladwell does make the argument that it takes 10,000 hours to get to the expert level. That's certainly an interesting rule of thumb and can only be maintained as a rule of thumb because it certainly isn't scientific at all. His definition of expertise and the appropriate one are slightly different. The other thing about this chart that you put back up is it says expert is always in flow. That's also not necessarily correct.
Okay.
flow is a totally different concept, and she's using it in a colloquial sense, whereas flow is an actual academic concept developed by a guy whose name is too long for me to recall and pronounce.
Mahali.
Yeah, it's a difficult concept, but I see what she's saying in that what she means is that when you reach a level of expertise, the level of cognitive load, the level of mental effort tends to decrease, and you're able to just kind of settle into it. Again, driving being the quintessential example. The chances are good that as you drove home or from somewhere else, you're not having to think about the act of driving so much until you get to somewhere where you're not familiar. Right? This is exactly why we do silly things like turn down the radio when we are in a new city looking for directions, not just so we can hear the GPS. What we're doing is we're subconsciously, it's metacognition, right? We're metacognitively regulating the inputs into our working memory. So we turn down the radio because we're trying to reduce the load on our working memory. So in our classroom situations, we need to be cautious that as we talked a little in our chat about modeling and so on, we as educators, and you brought this up earlier, Darren, we can sometimes go overboard and the wash, rinse, repeat. And so there's an effect when we talk about cognitive load research called the expertise reversal effect. You all are likely expert drivers. If I were to get into your passenger seat and try to teach you how to drive, despite your already being experts, that would be an extra imposition onto your working memory and therefore useless. So we need to be on the lookout when we're teaching our kids as to when it's time to just say, okay, you've got this, you go run with it. You don't need me to talk to you about it anymore. And that's when hopefully we're taking the training wheels off, and they've gotten beyond the amateur, and they're kind of on that uphill battle to reach expertise, particularly in a mathematical concept in this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also a distinction to be made between an expert doer and an expert teacher. Because I think an expert, let's take your driving example. If you're an expert doer at driving, then you can do it in flow, without thinking. You know where you are. There's a map in your head about where you are in the city that you're in and how to get from where you are to where you want to be. And you can get from one place to another without really thinking about it. But to be an expert teacher, well, that's different. You now have to think about what are all those things that are going on inside your head that allow you to be at ease and comfortable and to get from anywhere to anywhere in the city. Like, how do you get a map in your head? What does that map look like? How do you use that map? What are the signs around you that you use to identify your position without using a GPS device so that you know where you are on the map? Now, take all of that and apply it to any content area. And you know what? This is maybe this is the problem with education in higher ed, because we've all had this experience of having wonderful teachers in K-12, and then you go to university and you say, look, the guy obviously knows his stuff, but he can't teach it for beans. And I think that's the difference between an expert doer and an expert teacher. An expert doer can do it. They can't necessarily articulate why they can do it. They can get into flow and they can be, comfortable and at ease with what they're doing. But when it comes to teaching it, that really requires a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of deep reflection to figure out what are those ordering principles that you're in order to convey that knowledge to others who don't have it yet. And I think that's what distinguishes, the better teachers from the not as good, is they know those principles. They know what are the underlying concepts to share or network of understandings to share with their students to help make them rock more.
Yep, I think that's an absolutely excellent point.
It'd be interesting to explore that a bit, the difference between an expert doer and an expert teacher.
You're right. I want to say somebody was going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I think this graphic does point out something quite interesting in that through some of the reading I'm doing for Richard Strier's course right now, there's quite a bit of reading that will point out that in most cases people will stick to an intermediate challenge, and that most often people aren't challenged to get to that expert stage. what I think I really want to point out here is that in our classrooms, generally what we're doing is we're getting to that, very much as that graphic that was just up would share with us, and it's that idea that now that I can do it, I'll just keep doing it that same way. They get to a functional stage, and generally in our society what we're seeing, and is, I kind of power read that blog post a little bit, but what we most commonly see in our society is that because of the many different areas of focus that a person could possibly have, people will often try and develop amateur knowledge and experience in a whole bunch of stuff, and people are less likely to go into an expert stage just on the basis of that, as I mentioned, the preference for an intermediate challenge and a wide range of possibilities.
Yeah, and I'd also say that there's a question of motivation there. There's a question of what does it really require to take somebody, or to help somebody get the impetus to go from the amateur to expert stage. There are certain things that I have absolutely no desire to be an expert at, that being an amateur at is absolutely okay. Ice skating, might be a prime example. I have no desire to be an expert skater. I'm clumsy on the ice and so on. But, hockey players, for example, and I totally did that for your benefit, being in Canada. No good hockey player would ever argue that it's okay to be an amateur skater. So there's a question of motivation, which is a whole different conversation for a whole different day. I want to talk about Bud's question that he brought into the chat room. He asked, I scrolled past it. He asked, when is doing a sufficient teacher? But I would argue that only can be effective if it's a fairly simple procedural skill, where all of the skill is really open. It's really where not much of it is tacit. For example, I'm not going to learn driving. I keep using that as an example, but when it was time for me to learn to drive, my parents did more than just tell me to watch them. It requires the explanation of underlying principles behind at least the basics of how a vehicle functions, and so on and so forth, and the proper steps required. Doing is, as Mike points out, and Scott did as well, doing is effective when we're talking about exclusively a skill. Remember, we have to separate between procedural and declarative knowledge, but I'd be curious if you want to Skype in or call in and talk a little more about what you were asking. And you'd need to tell me what you mean by emergent expertise. Perhaps that's that's the up the hill between amateur and expert. You can call in using the dial-in number that's there if you want to use your phone. You can Skype in. There's a Skype button. There's an arrow there by information. And there's a Skype button that you can Skype in that'll take you directly to the conference as well. And by the way, Bud, as you're connecting, I just want to I don't know if you caught this, but we were kind of using the working definition of expertise as when we go from novice along the novice to expert continuum. What we're talking about in this particular conversation is moving to a point where the performance of a skill, in our case medical education to begin with, doesn't require such a high level of cognitive load. I'm not sure that the first person who wrote a novel actually sat down and said, I'm going to write the first novel. I would gather that someone sat down to do something. But writing a novel and putting pen to paper is a very different than a fully procedural skill like driving or something along those lines, or even a mathematical concept.
But even with writing a novel, like if you look at the novel through history, look at something like Crime and Punishment or Les Miserables, or even novels of Charles Dickens, who they need to make they're publishing their books basically as serials in the newspaper every week. So that's how they make a living. So they very often would draw out the story much longer than it needed to be. But the stories were wonderful, absolutely spectacular. A modern novel today would never be written in that style. So even the novel has evolved over time. And you've got people writing books now, or even just look at the movies. So when I was a kid, or if you have young kids and you watch some of those older Disney movies, they always start with the credits at the front, and there's a lot of music, and they kind of go through. It's a very, very slow start. Whereas a modern movie almost always starts with action. Someone is doing something. There's a chase. There's people interacting in some environment somewhere, whatever it is. So even that, the way we tell stories has evolved. Now, why? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb. I'll say, I think part of the reason that we see that evolution in stories is because we're getting better at it. With each iteration, we get better at it, and we find the thing that makes the story more compelling, more quickly, and more engaging for longer periods of time.
But
so, I mean, this process of watch it, do it, teach it, would apply there too.
Yeah, I think I have. Can you guys hear me?
We sure can.
Hey, how you doing, bud?
Hey, I'm good, guys. Yeah, I've been listening to the whole conversation, and the thing that I'm trying to articulate and doing a poor job of is, I guess, tasks where expertise is in question. So what I was trying to ask was, and I know I'm stretching some of the definitions that you guys are using, but I have to find my own conversation thread so that I can get back to my own question. That says a lot about my lack of expertise. I guess I just wonder when seeing it done and doing it based upon the model that you saw and then doing it yourself is sufficient to be the teacher as opposed to the person doing it having to be doing a teaching process separate from the doing of the thing.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so apprenticing. I sit at the wheel, I make the pot again and again. I'm good at it. It is no longer requiring a great deal of cognitive load. I learned to do it by watching the other person at the next wheel making a pot. And my pot holds water, and it's pretty. I was never explicitly shown how to do that. There was not a teacher teaching. I'm doing air quotes here to say teaching, right? And I am not air quotes teaching it to somebody else, but I've acquired the skill and I've gotten quite good at it. How does that play into your conversation?
Well,
I would argue
does it touch on? We were talking about the difference between an expert doer and an expert teacher, and how those are different things. Would that kind of resonate a little bit with what you're saying?
Well, a little bit, but there was the statement made a couple of times that the teaching needs to happen so that the person is. I don't know. That's setting off my spider sense.
It's a question of complexity. So because your example of the making of the pot is not an inherently complex task, and that's one that lends itself to one observing someone else doing said task, leading to a level of expertise. So writing, I would argue, is something that does not lend itself well to that. One of my very early dissertation advisors kind of attempted this with me, and she gave me dissertations to read in the hopes that in reading those dissertations, I would then glean from those dissertations appropriate qualities of how to write a good dissertation. Well, that failed miserably. So I think what this leads to is a question of how much guidance is necessary in education in general and in the context of this conversation. I would argue something like writing or something like complex mathematical concepts are ones that will require a higher level of guidance than the creation of a minimalistic pot that holds water, and if it's not perfectly symmetrical, then who cares?
Well, I guess that's where my spider sense would tingle again. I mean, the reason why you valued, say, a gallbladder removal is that it's harder, and I'm air quotes. Somebody figured out how to do that first. Nobody could have taught the first gallbladder remover, pardon the poor word there, how to remove a gallbladder, and yet it happened before there was somebody who had sufficient expertise to teach it. I'm just wondering if, and maybe I'm hearing this conversation completely wrong, but it sounds like what I'm hearing is that really complex things require teaching to happen for them to happen, and I don't think that makes sense if really complex things emerge prior to somebody being able to teach about them.
I'm not sure that they require them, but there is a question of efficiency. Certainly most anything can be taught by trial and error, but at the same time, you would never in the world go to a surgeon who says, well, you know, I never really learned how to do this, I'm going to figure out how to do this. You anticipate in real life that your surgeon who's going to remove your gallbladder has been taught, has learned, and has successfully done. Same thing, school is a time-based entity more than it is a skill-based entity. So there's a question of efficiency, right? I don't have the luxury of letting my kids kind of stumble their way through learning, such as we would argue in certain constructivist style teaching environments. You know, there's a question of efficiency when there is teaching. So if you have two different options, right? You can let this, what you referred to as emergent expertise, you can let somebody figure something out on their own and, you know, kind of go through the stumbling through it, and eventually they figure it out, and, you know, maybe they figure out a superstitious way to do it, or maybe they have, if I figured out how to get to your house, if I just stumbled across the Hunt household, and yet it took me 3 hours to get there when it could have taken me 30 minutes, you know, you'd say, well, you know, you could have gotten here much quicker, or, you know, if you'd have taken this road versus this road. So we inherently place value on efficiency, I think, in education based on the fact that, you know, kids go to my school for 180 days a year.
Mm-hmm. No, I wouldn't say that it's more efficient, and I get that constraint. Your conversation has led me to wonder about the emergence of new expertise, and if there must be a taught element into, I'm butchering this, but if there must be a teacher to guide somebody to a new place, then where do the new places come from?
I'm not
sure. Maybe that's how you define teacher, right? Like teacher, you know, your teacher could be a book. Your teacher could be. I saw this really bad movie yesterday called Bulletproof Monk. And there's a fella in the movie that has this movie theater, and what he does is he shows martial arts movies, and that's how he learns how to do kung fu, because he copies what he sees in the movie. So in that case, the old movies are his teachers. You know, so you know.
Yeah, but in that case, you've got a defined domain of expertise, right? I mean, yeah, well, I guess I'm interested in.
Is sketchy, bud. I think the question is not where does new expertise come from. I think the question is where do new skills come from. Because expertise determines whether we're a novice or an expert or something, determines how well we're able to do it and how much load there is on the working memory during the performance of that skill. So the question is not where does new expertise come from. The question is where do new skills come from. And I would argue that comes from previous skills, or that comes from, you know, previous existing cognitive schemata, right? So as you go to sit down and write something new, even if you try to write something in a brand new form, fashion, method, whatever, that's going to be almost entirely informed by your previous experiences. You know, none of us are coming at something new with a tabula rasa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. For fear of dominating and taking you guys down a weird path, I'll withdraw.
You don't have to.
I want to push on that some. So
okay, good.
So okay, there is no tabula rasa. I'm with you, right? Everything's contextual, but so are notions of expertise and noviceness. So are our expectations for what counts as a good job on a gallbladder operation. I mean, some of those are finite, definitely, right? The patient dies, you probably did a poor job. But I'm not quite ready to say that there must be a teacher involved in that process. And I know that a teacher can be defined broadly. And again, I know you guys are working from some particular definitions, and I may just be completely off. So, like I say, I don't want to take folks down too far.
This conversation never had the presupposition that there must be a teacher. This just started from the impetus of the conversation was the notion of what's the role of teaching from a student perspective? does a student need to teach in order to effectively be able to say that they've learned? Kind of where does that come into play? I would argue there's certainly a strong role for the teacher, but I wouldn't say that 100% of the time a teacher is required for the development of expertise.
Yeah, and I guess to state it in the terms of the original conversation, I'd say that teaching it at the end is irrelevant to whether or not it's learning.
Okay, now that's
teaching is irrelevant to learning? Is that what you said?
It's not a necessary requirement of knowing something that you teach it to somebody else. You can own it without.
Oh yeah, I agree. You can know a thing without having to teach it to someone else. But the act of teaching it to someone else deepens your own understanding of that thing. But
and that gets me. Yeah, sure. Yeah, and that gets me back to my original point: is that it might be that I think you said something like there can be expertise without teacher, and my original question was basically, can the expertise itself service the teacher? And I guess I would still want to say it could. And that's where I really will shut up now, because I know I'm not quite where you guys are, and I apologize.
No, it's fine. I would agree, but it's a very qualified agreement, and I maintain that my qualification would be that only works with a very simple procedural skill. But
okay.
Anybody else wants to jump in and take this conversation down a similar or a different path as we wrap it up here?
I'm gonna throw out there that I think my feeling is that we're probably in general pretty close to the way we see this. Let me kind of summarize a little bit about what I've heard, and you guys push back and tell me the bits that I'm not getting. So, Bud, you're making the claim, for example, that a person can learn or know a thing without necessarily having a teacher, although we can define teacher in a very broad sense. It doesn't necessarily have to be another person. And the skill to be able to do a thing doesn't necessitate that someone teaches a thing in order to actually learn it, although we are on the same page in that we say that if you do go that route, you will have a deeper understanding of the content that you've learned once you've taught it to someone else. The Halstead's model of watch one, do one, teach one, which I've spoken about a lot in bringing it into a K-12 classroom, is it's one that works because it plays on that notion that knowing a thing and teaching a thing is not the same thing, and teaching a thing leads to much deeper understanding of the thing. And I think we're pretty much in agreement about that. I think where the points that we're discussing is maybe fine-tuning our notions of expertise and fine-tuning the notion of, just how deep does a kid have to go in order to learn something?
I agree. And on that note, we'll wrap it up. Thank you for all of you that have joined us today. I will post the recording of this on my blog or somewhere in the next few days. And this has been fun. And I would love, Darren, if you're interested, I'd love to continue this conversation. Perhaps we'll look more deeply at what expertise means, or
I would love that.
Other topics.
I would love that. So, but let me ask you one question before we go, because I've talked about this a lot. Watch it, do it, teach it, and I think I've had a chance to maybe articulate a little bit about the context in which I discuss it. Do you think I'm doing a disservice by just sharing with teachers this perspective in this way?
No, not necessarily. I would just beg you to please articulate that so see one, do one, teach one. Mm-hmm. In the teach one, before one gets to the teach one, one must really understand why one does what one does. Mm-hmm. One must really understand.
I like that.
It's not okay to simply say. It's not. You have to consider the issues with expert self-report. Take the driving example from earlier. Remember that when folks get to the teaching portion, they're going to leave out steps. Right. So make sure that the steps that you teach are sufficiently articulated and not just gleaned to where they know the steps inside and out, and then can effectively articulate those steps to make sure that they don't leave any out when they get to the teaching portion of it. But given the errors inherent with expert self-report, if you keep those in mind, there's nothing wrong with talking about the Halstedian model
Right.
in K through 12 education.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. I really, it kind of resonates with me a lot, because that understanding why you do what you do and the way you do it, kind of, for what I'm hearing when I hear that, is kind of understanding those second-order principles, not the pure content of the discipline, but the organizing principles of that content. And that generally is not explicitly taught. And I think if we spend some time, number one, figuring out what those things are, I'm not sure that we necessarily do know what they are, certainly in all the disciplines. And if we do, how do we use that to improve our teaching? I think that's a study worth merit.
I agree.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris.
Good.
This was a great time.
Thank you all. And by the way, if any of you all want an invite to Meeting Burner so you can try out Meeting Burner yourselves, hit me up on Twitter. I'll be more than happy to give you one. Thanks all for coming by, and we'll see you around.
Cheers.